All right, thanks everybody again for coming out tonight. And I'm just going to read a short introduction to our speaker. Tonight's presentation entitled Exploring Oregon's Ancient Forests is presented by Chandra LeGue. This presentation will explain Oregon's ancient forests from dripping coastal forests of giant Douglas firs, high desert groves of massive Ponderosa pines, and lush mixed conifer forests surrounding jagged Cascade peaks, and why they are vital to our state's future for clean water, climate change, wildlife, recreation, and so much more. Chandra is a Western Oregon field coordinator for Oregon Wild, and she just published the guide, Oregon Ancient Forest Hiking Guide, to help you get to know and love these incredible places. She will talk about some of the fundamentals of these forests, what makes them an ancient forest, what types exist in Oregon, where they are, who manages them, why so few still survive, and what threats they continue to face. She'll also highlight a variety of the hiking experiences found in the book, covering natural history, human history, flora and fauna, so you may come away with a better understanding of these complex ecosystems and their extraordinary value. Also, some trails in and around our watershed will be featured. Born and raised in southeastern Michigan, Chandra is proud to engage in work protecting and restoring the forests and wildlands of Oregon, her adopted home state. She earned a BS in biology from Carthage College in Wisconsin before moving to Oregon in 1999 to earn her master's degree in environmental studies at the University of Oregon. Eugene has been her home since. She currently serves on the board of directors of the Middle Fork Willamette Watershed Council, our neighbors, and has led dozens of hikes in the Eugene area for Oregon Wild supporters. Chandra has worked for Oregon Wild since 2003, promoting policies that protect and restore Oregon's forests. And with that, let's welcome Chandra up here.
Thank you. There's your clicker.
Okay, I'm going to try not to hold this. I hate holding things while I'm trying to talk. So, hi, everybody. Thanks for being here, and I hope to share some great information with you. And at the end, I'll leave some time for Q&A if you have questions about anything I talk about. And we'll see if we can make the clicker work. Click. It's just very far away from the computer. That's the problem. Aha. Ah. Okay. Well, I am supposing that many of you are here because you love to hike. Who here likes to hike? Oh, yeah. Awesome. Good. Or that you also are into forests. Who's into forests? All right. Cool. I'm in good company. So I love to hike. And as my intro that Maggie read said, I grew up in Michigan. And my love of getting outdoors really started when I was quite young. I was a Girl Scout, and I got to go camping and hiking and spend a lot of outside just roaming around in my rural home. So that's where it kind of started. But when I moved to Oregon 20 years ago, my love for the outdoors really kicked into high gear because, as you all know, since you live here, this is just an amazing place if you love forests and you love hiking. So I feel like I hit the jackpot by moving across the country. So I love hiking for lots of reasons, and you might too. I do love getting up to high vantage points and getting views of the Cascade summits. I also love hiking to waterfalls and along streams for the fresh air and the beauty of those things. I love meadows filled with pollinators and wildflowers and open space. But I really especially love hiking in forests. So I feel really, really lucky that part of my job with Oregon Wild is taking people out on hikes to some of my favorite places. So over the last dozen or so years, as I've worked for Oregon Wild, I've been able to take folks out about once a month to some of the places within a couple hours of Eugene and share my passion for the outdoors and for our forests. And I feel really, really lucky that I get to do that. And being able to do that and explore some of the places in all of our backyard here led me to appreciate those forests even more and to kind of set myself up for writing a book about hiking in those forests. So there's a lot of other things that I've drawn on for writing this book. I've worked for Oregon Wild for 16 years, and we are primarily an advocacy organization that's been around since 1974. Our mission is to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy. And that's been pretty successful over in some categories over the years. And we're still working on it in many others. But it's an organization I feel very passionate about and feel lucky to work for. And while the word forest doesn't appear in Oregon Wild's mission that I just read, forests are absolutely an essential part of all of the work we've done over the last 45 years. We've been involved in getting protections for endangered species like northern spotted owls, Pacific salmon, and other wildlife that depend on forest ecosystems. We've been involved in gaining permanent protections for wilderness areas like the Three Sisters, the Strawberry Mountains, and most recently, the Devil's Staircase Wilderness in the Coast Range, which you can see up here. Devil's Staircase Wilderness, for those of you who don't know, is the last large block of ancient forests that have left in the Oregon Coast Range that has never been logged. It's about 26 to 30,000 acres of pristine ancient forests with only one road that goes through the middle, and that's going to be decommissioned now that it's a wilderness area. There are no trails, so you won't find it in my book. But it's absolutely spectacular, and one of the places in Oregon that I would say feels most like wilderness that we can wrap our heads around, if we can wrap our heads around what that might feel like. That statistic that in the trivia question rounds of how much of Oregon's wilderness is forest, 84%, was actually a real shocker for me. I heard some grumblings about maybe it wasn't that high, but because we think of wilderness areas, which are protected by Congress, as being kind of a lot of our mountains, right? Mount Jefferson, Mount Washington, the Three Sisters. But really there is actually a lot of wilderness that spills down around the sides of those mountains. And one of the reasons that Oregon Wild has focused on protecting wilderness is because there are forests involved. We've also worked over the years to protect the 2 million acres of roadless areas across the state. We've challenged management plans that would shrink riparian and stream buffers. And we've fought for rules that protect large trees across central and eastern Oregon, where things are look a little different than here in western Oregon. So in my job, as fun as leading hikes is, I also get to be an advocate for Oregon's forests in all of these ways that I've just been describing. I get to defend policies and laws that are meant to protect and guide forest restoration. I work with federal agencies like the Forest Service to ensure that there's ecologically sound management happening on our public forest lands. And the fact is that forests need advocates, and here's why. Over the last century, we have destroyed or fragmented almost all of the diverse unlogged forests in Oregon. So what once looked like this beautiful landscape, this is around Tidbits Mountain, has been changed pretty dramatically. We have logged much of our old growth forests, and we have fragmented our national forests. This picture up in the upper right corner is of a part of the Willamette National Forest, and you can see all of the little patches that have been clear cut over the years. So today we only have about 15 to 20% of our forests that have not been logged. Those are what I'll call ancient forests, and I'll describe what I mean by that in a little bit. So all of this fragmentation from logging and road building has had big impacts on our once thriving forest ecosystems and everything that they provide for us. Okay. So in Western Oregon, those scenes I just showed look pretty familiar probably. In Eastern Oregon, we've also built a lot of roads and done a lot of logging, but it looks a little bit different. There, we've removed just the largest trees in many areas in a process called high grading, as well as some clear cutting. And we've also excluded fire from this landscape where fire used to be quite common. Show me fire picture. Yes. Okay. So because we've suppressed fires in in the Ponderosa Pine, especially forests in Eastern Oregon, small trees have grown in and are kind of crowding out and competing for resources with the big Ponderosa pines that would have been standing more alone in many circumstances. We've also added an invasive species called the cow to many of these Eastern Oregon landscapes, which has also altered vegetations and the way that the forests grow. So the fragmentation and the changes to the forests in Eastern Oregon look a little bit different than what we're used to over here. Okay. So I'm going to read just a short passage from my book that I hope illustrates some of the issues that we're getting at and why this whole thing is so important. From a small lake on the western slope of the Cascades, where some friends and I had set up our tents beneath towering western hemlocks and red cedars the night before, we set off through the dense forest, following the stream flowing from the lake. There was no trail. We were deep in the wild and in rugged country where trail building and maintenance were not prudent endeavors. And the shrubs, evergreen huckleberry, Oregon grape, devil's club, formed green walls, making forward progress difficult. Climbing up on fallen logs 3 to 5 feet thick, we followed an elevated highway, our path a giant array of pickup sticks. Whenever we needed a short break from the strenuous route, we gazed upward in awe at the towering trees surrounding us. The world was draped in countless shades of green, stacked in lacy layers. Everything smelled fresh and dirty and old at the same time. Small openings in the forest stood out, washed in sunshine. Birds and squirrels flittered in the underbrush, heard but not seen. We continued for hours, taking it all in. We stopped for lunch, damp, warm, scratched up, but reveling in the beauty and loving every second of the experience in a grove of some of the fattest, tallest trees I'd ever seen. That's in the picture on the left. It was the epitome of peace, of joy, of camaraderie with nature and each other. While my friends perched on logs to enjoy their sandwiches, I wandered away for a vantage point, looking to capture the moment with my camera, as I did here. Using the thick bark of a giant tree, I pulled myself up onto a down log. Leaning on the giant and steadying myself for the photo, my hand hit paper. I looked. My heart dropped. It was a marker for a timber sale. The sign that I encountered that afternoon in the magnificent ancient forest grove was fortunately also ancient. The imminent threat to that grove, very real 15 years earlier, had been neutralized thanks to the persistent and adamant actions of citizens who also valued that special place. As federal land managers prepared to build a road and rev up the chainsaws in that grove, forest advocates ensured that it was instead protected as the Opal Creek Wilderness. Sorry. Oops. That worked. Now it decided to work. Sorry, the wrong way. Okay. All right, so the Opal Creek example was essentially the setting for the 1991 book that was the inspiration for my book, Oregon's Ancient Forests. Written by Wendell Wood, who worked and volunteered for Oregon Wild for much of its history, the book came at a time when we were still logging ancient forests at an astounding rate. Now, Wendell was a phenomenal naturalist and a fierce advocate for forests, the Klamath River Basin, and other wild places. He saw the potential in a hiking guide that would inspire people to visit our last remaining ancient forests and inspire them to get involved in the efforts to protect them. Now, nearly 30 years later, groups like Oregon Wild are still fighting some of the battles that Wendell was. While some of the forests that Wendell was fighting for are now protected as wilderness, like Devil's Staircase, or they're protected as roadless areas under the Roadless rule, or they have other strong management protections. There are others that are still under threat from corporate greed, loopholes in protective laws, and political forces that prioritize corporate profits over ecosystems that are centuries old. So I felt that in the wake of advocates like Wendell, that a book for a new generation of Oregonians and forest lovers was still very relevant. And so I'm glad to be able to present that new book to you now. Okay. All right, well, first I'm going to back up a sec and talk about this term ancient forest that is in the title of the book and that I'm going to keep using. I know a lot of us are probably familiar with the term old growth, but I don't really like to use that term, and I'm broadening the definition for the purposes of this book, because I feel like it makes people think of just old trees. And so I know that many of you were stumped by the question earlier about what defines an ancient forest, and the first one seemed pretty obvious. It's filled with big old trees. Well, big old trees are part of it, but it goes beyond that. I know that I don't like to be just defined by my age. I don't know about you. So I think that expanding the definition beyond just old trees is really important. So the way that I define ancient forests is a forest that has grown and developed naturally over a long period of time without much human interference. It's pretty simple and pretty broad. But it means that it encompasses a lot of what we would think about as old growth. And in Western Oregon, there's a fairly well-recognized definition of an old growth forest that says that there's big old trees, as you can see in this picture. There's also a multi-layered canopy with lots of different tree species. There's also going to be standing dead trees, or snags, and a lot of downwood when those snags fall over onto the ground. So those are some of the structural components, that was the answer to the trivia question, that define a lot of Western Oregon's old growth forests. But when we're talking about ancient forests that have grown and developed without much human interference, that also brings in forests that have burned but are regrowing naturally, that weren't logged after that fire. And so that means that most of the trees might be young and that the canopy is dominated by dead trees. But that still fits that definition of ancient forests. There's actually a lot of clicking in this one, Maggie. So that's what an ancient forest might look like in Western Oregon. But there are a lot of different forest types across Oregon. And I know that this picture might be a little fuzzy, but the different colors essentially correspond with different primary forest types. So there's some small ones that are just in small pockets, like quaking aspen. It gets its own forest type, and it's just an area that's dominated by quaking aspen. But then the yellow on this map is the Ponderosa Pine forest type, which covers a lot of central and eastern Oregon, and is dominated by Ponderosa pine. But there's also other tree species mixed in, but it's typically drier and doesn't have that same type of forest structure that we think about with Douglas fir forests here in western Oregon. On the Oregon coast, we have what I'm calling the coastal fog zone forests that are dominated by Sitka spruce trees, as well as western hemlock and red cedar that only grow within a short distance of the coast. And down in southern Oregon, there's also coast redwoods that live in this zone. And then, of course, all the green on this map is the Douglas fir forest type that we're most familiar with here in our backyard, and has more of that that classic old growth structure that you might be thinking of, and that the previous slide showed. So there's a lot of diversity of different forest types across Oregon, but there's also a ton of diversity within each forest. And that's because these forests are incredibly dynamic. They're not stuck in any one state of being. They're always changing. And that can be at large scales, like a fire burns and it starts over from scratch. Or because there was a windstorm and a few trees fell over and it opened up an opportunity for sun-loving trees to get established in an opening. And then there's just because of that, there's tons of biodiversity. So all of the things that are fun to explore about an old forest are because of this diversity of structure and the dynamism of these ancient forests. So up here I've got some pictures of mushrooms and mosses and lichens, wildflowers, dead trees that have been pecked open by woodpeckers and in this case have fallen over. There's a nice nurse log that's been on the ground for probably 100 years, and there's some pretty big hemlocks starting to grow out of that tree that's fallen on the forest floor, giving the next generation a leg up. So all of this diversity and structure and big trees and diversity of trees are important for other functions of the forest ecosystem as well. And one of the most important is water. Water, of course, is vitally important to all of us, to the fish that we find so important, and for groups like watershed councils, we're working on ensuring that our streams are healthy and that we can give back and help restore some of our streams. But it's really the ancient forests that are nature's workers. So if we don't have to be the human restorers, our forests can do that job for us. So ancient forests with those big trees and all that diversity provide structure to the streams. Those trees fall into the water and provide, they trap gravel and they provide rearing habitat for fish. They're also forming the backbone of the food web in a stream. All that leaf litter, for example, is feeding little microorganisms that then feed bugs, which then feed salmon. Forest canopies are also shading and cooling streams, which is really important for salmon. And the forest soils, which are often really deep and organic and rich, are filtering our water slowly, releasing water and snow into our watersheds instead of just at a slower rate, instead of just rushing off down the pavement. So forests can be sort of a sponge and provide some of these great things that then our municipalities, the city doesn't have to invest in really expensive water filtration if the forest is helping to do the job of purifying our water for us. It's so funny. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't work. Can you get me, Maggie? All right. Another way that that forests, especially ancient forests, are important with all that diversity is that it provides a diversity of homes for a lot of different wildlife. Now, I haven't seen all of these wildlife forms in my travels around Oregon. Maybe you guys have. But that doesn't mean they're not out there and that there's not good habitat in ancient forests. So from little critters like millipedes that are chomping up needles on the forest floor and recycling them, to woodpeckers that are being engineers in those snags and eating grubs and thriving in burned forests in many places, to the northern spotted owl, which absolutely depends on these Douglas fir forests with those multi-layered canopies, the large trees in the overstory, and in some cases burned forests. They definitely can live in burned forests. I know that was another tricky one on the trivia questions. We've been hearing a lot in the news lately about climate change with the UN meeting, and also about the Amazon forests and how those are burning and being converted. That's been going on for a long time. But I think another important thing that everyone needs to realize is that Oregon's forests play an absolutely vital role in mitigating climate change, storing carbon for the future, as well as taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Not only that, and that is that we can play a role by protecting forests here in the global scale of things, but we also, having these ancient forests will also help all sorts of other plants and animals adapt as our climate warms and changes. The cooler temperatures, the biodiversity that is included in ancient forests means that they're refuges for songbirds, for insects, for critters that maybe can't move as quickly as others, I guess, that migrate. And all this forest structure and cooler temperatures will be vital as everything kind of changes. All right. So I've talked a lot about why these forests are important, and also that there aren't very many of them left. And yet, somehow I wrote a book with hikes in old forests all across Oregon. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where they are. So this map shows really generally where our public forests are in Oregon. And I'm focusing on that because that's pretty much where most of our ancient forests are, the areas that haven't been logged, that have grown and developed naturally for a long time. So in this map, there's green, which is our national forest managed by the Forest Service. And I don't have all the different layers on here because that would make for a very busy map. But in our national forest, there's different layers of protection for forests. So one of those is wilderness, which I already talked a little bit about. Congress can designate wilderness, and it means that it's permanently protected from logging and road building and other development. And we have about 4 million acres of wilderness, actually no, 2.5 million acres of wilderness in Oregon. But there's all other layers as well. Some of those are management policies, like the Northwest Forest Plan here in Western Oregon, that protects some of our last ancient forests, but not all of it. There's also a designation that comes from Congress called Wild and Scenic Rivers. And wild and scenic rivers basically designate wild and scenic rivers to be protected and not developed. They can't have dams. In some cases, there can't be mining on them. Often they have roads or trails nearby, but it means that the forest on either side of a designated wild and scenic river is also protected from most logging and development. So one of the tiebreaker questions was about wild and scenic rivers, and the system of rivers in Oregon protects about 500,000 acres of forests. So they're an important designation for our forests. There's also, we have national monuments and national parks in Oregon. This map doesn't show the national monuments, but it shows Crater Lake National Park up there in brown. And then this map also shows state lands in yellow and BLM lands in sort of the peachy color. So we have a bunch of those, and but there's not quite as many protections there for ancient forests. On state lands in particular, most of those are managed for timber production, though there are some ancient forests left in some of our state parks, which are featured in the book in the North Coast. And then the Elliott State Forest has some ancient forests left, but it's not necessarily protected in any way. And then on BLM land, which is a good chunk of western Oregon, we have some ancient forests left, but there aren't very many trails in them, so there's not many featured in this book, for example. And they have a new management plan that will make it harder to protect some of those remaining ancient forests. All right, so here's just an example from the book. This is one of the regions that I identify and where I have hikes in the book. It's an example from the Siskiyou Crest region that kind of shows some of the overlap of some of these protections and where the hikes are. So if you can see it, there's brown boxes with a number inside, and that's where the hikes are. And in this example, there's one over here that is in the Oregon Caves National Monument, so that's a pretty good protection level. Down here, we've got one in the Red Buttes Wilderness. Over here on the above the Applegate Reservoir, it's in a designated roadless area. And then over here, there's 3 hikes that are in the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument that are on BLM land, but also a national monument. So all of those have a fair number of protections that people have worked hard to achieve so that these ancient forests remain standing. And that's why they're still there. All right, so to get in a little bit more about what's in the book and what went into it, I'll just throw this up here. I had never written a book before. I've been working as a forest advocate for many years, and I go on a lot of hikes, but that doesn't mean that I've written up a bunch of hikes, and I didn't know how to write a book. So I definitely had a lot of guidance. Not only Wendell Wood's book that I had up there before, which was not only an inspiration, but also served as sort of an idea pile for where I might go to visit ancient forests across the state. But I also looked at other guidebooks that I've been using for many years, Bill Sullivan's books and many others, as well as other resources, plants identification, because in some parts of Oregon, I wasn't that familiar with the trees, for example. I was pretty clear on what I needed to bring in my backpack when I went hiking, so I've done a lot of hiking. But I added a few things because I was going out on trips to places I didn't know, and mostly by myself. So I got myself one of those little SOS satellite beacons, a can of bear spray, and a couple of other things, beefed up my first aid kit so that if anything happened out on the trail, I was prepared. Had a plan, let everyone that I cared about know where I was going to be and when I was coming back, all that smart stuff. And then I set out. I spent a lot of time camping across Oregon. I put about 4,000 miles on my Tacoma and about 400 miles on my hiking boots. And in the summer of 2017 and the beginning parts of 2018, I took a sabbatical from my regular job and got out there hiking. It was pretty great. I had to cover a lot of ground. This book covers all of Oregon. So in the book, I break it down into 14 different regions, kind of north to south over on the Coast Range, and then north to south going from Mount Hood down the Cascades, and then over into central Oregon, the Blue Mountains and the Wallowas. So it was a lot of work. But it meant that I got to spend time in some really amazing places. Does anyone recognize this scene? Does anyone know where this is? My husband doesn't get to answer. That's Strawberry Lake. It's in the Strawberry Mountain Wilderness, and it's one of my favorite places in Oregon. And I got to spend my hike up there and then walking around the lake with no company but a bald eagle. It was pretty great. But I also ran into a lot of roadblocks, sometimes literally. The summer of 2017 was a summer of fire in Oregon. So there were some places that were off limits. I couldn't go. The Columbia Gorge, for example, totally out of commission for hiking that summer. Down in southern Oregon, I ran into some places that were closed because of fire. Some of them I was able to go back to when I encountered these roadblocks, but some of those trails are still closed. And so that's just another lesson in the dynamic nature of these forests and the dynamic nature of hike guide writing as well. I also ran into some early snowstorms that winter of 2017, and so I wasn't able to get to some places, and it delayed some of the production of the book. But here we are 2 years later, and everything's going well. And then some other blocks that I ran into were emotional, not gonna lie. I'm not really afraid of bears. I had my bear spray, and I know you make noise and you make yourself big and all that, but hiking down a trail in a strange place, encountering pile after pile after pile of fresh bear scat is a little disconcerting. I never actually saw any bear at close range, so I felt pretty safe, actually. I did hike in a lot of wolf country, but I would have been so thrilled to see or hear a wolf, I can tell you that. Definitely was not afraid of encountering one. They're pretty afraid of people. I sure wish that had been the case, but I probably would be a little scared as well. So anyway, there's some of those mental roadblocks as well as physical ones that you have to get through in doing something like this. Okay, so what ended up in the book are 91 hikes across those 14 regions. The book has all the standard stuff you would find in any other modern hiking guide. It has GPS coordinates and turn-by-turn directions and what you'll find at the trailhead, and a description of what you find along the trail. And that's where I think, or I hope, this book really sets itself apart, because it's not just about getting to the summit and taking in the view and what mountains you see. It's really about what you see along the way. And it's about the ecosystem that you're hiking through. It's about some of the plants and animals that you might encounter there and what holds them all together. I have the different forest types that we already talked about that are listed, as well as management of different areas, how they're protected or how they're not protected. And I try to infuse it as well with my own sense of exploration and curiosity, because I think it's really fun to explore these forests. So I have some tips for enjoying forests, like getting to know the trees and plants and animals that might live in an area, taking guides with you, being curious, exploring off trail a little bit, carefully, of course, not to damage the environment, but they don't build trails necessarily to go by the most interesting trees. So if you see an interesting tree, go and take a look at it, explore, ask questions about why the forest looks the way it does, for example. So I just encourage people to do that throughout the book as well. Okay. All right, so to get into a couple of my favorites, and this is going to be scattered kind of across the whole state. One of those is pretty close to here, and that's Mary's Peak. I just love Mary's Peak. You do get the summit views, of course, and wildflower meadows and things like that that are pretty great to find on any hike. But climbing up on from Connor's Camp to do this loop, you just go through this amazing cathedral forest that I find pretty unique in the Coast Range. There's not very dense brush, and that is a little different. And then the other unique thing is that up towards the top of Mary's Peak, there's an old-growth noble fir forest. And that's only there because Mary's Peak is the highest peak in the Coast Range. And so when our environment was cooler and moister and there was more snow happening in this area, noble firs were a little bit more common. And as the climate warmed, they kind of receded, kind of up and up. And because this is the highest point, that's where it's now the only place in the Coast Range that they can live. They're more of a higher elevation, cold-loving tree. So they're really beautiful, and it's kind of a remnant up there on Mary's Peak. Hopefully they'll hang on as our climate continues to warm, but I would also say maybe go and see them soon. Unfortunately, this is one of the hikes that you have to drive through the beautiful industrial forest landscape and see what could have been if Mary's Peak weren't in a roadless area that the Siskiyou National Forest manages. All right, down in the coastal fog zone on the south coast, a lot of people don't realize that there are redwoods in Oregon. We all know and love the redwoods of Northern California, but it turns out that coast redwoods actually don't see the line on the map. So they do grow in Oregon in the Winchuck and the Chetco River drainages just over the border. And there's two short, lovely nature trails, the Redwood Nature Trail and Oregon Redwoods Trail. They're only about a mile long, but you get a taste of these beautiful forests, these giant trees, without having to go to California. It's a win-win. I really don't have anything against California, sorry. Also down in that area, but further inland, is in the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument is this lovely place called Grizzly Peak. Grizzly Peak has a lot of diversity. This photo shows the burned area. It burned about 20 years ago. But on the way there, you hike through a really beautiful mid-elevation mixed conifer forest. And there's a whole bunch of little meadows along the way with a spectacular wildflower display. And the time I was there, more butterflies than you could shake your fist at. It's just stunning. The Cascade Siskiyou National Monument is the only national monument in the country that was designated for its biodiversity. So this area fits right into that. It's got a lot of different insect and other pollinator species, wildflowers, and a huge diversity of trees. When you get up to this sort of summit area in the burn, it's a great opportunity to see an area recovering naturally from a fire. So you can even see in this picture that there's some young trees coming up. There's a whole lot of shrubs. There's elderberries in bloom in this photo. And you can just kind of think about how this forest is still alive and not just, completely destroyed by fire, which a lot of people sometimes think. All right, moving into the Cascades. The section of the book that has the most hikes is the Upper Willamette and Mackenzie River section. And it's our backyard, so we all probably recognize that there's a lot of great trails in the Willamette National Forest. So from the Upper Mackenzie, where there are 3 hikes that are featured in the book up in that general area, absolute favorite of mine. I do not send people to Blue Pool because you all hopefully know that it's completely overrun. But it's really beautiful. But there's other sections of the Mackenzie River Trail that are stunning, have ancient forests, and one of the hikes goes to the source of the Mackenzie at Clear Lake, to the spring there that's feeding the whole watershed. Maggie, help me out. Okay. In the Coast Fork watershed, there are 2 hikes, and that I include in the book. There are, of course, lots more hikes in the Coast Fork watershed. But the 2 that I include are Bryce Creek and Fairview Creek. How many of you have ever been to Fairview Creek? Yeah, a handful. It's not very well known. It's actually in a fairly large roadless area and managed as such by the Umpqua National Forest. So it has some protections. And it's just a lovely, flattish hike along a creek. And so I would definitely recommend it, though I haven't been since May, and it had a lot of snow down in May, so I'm not sure if it's been cleaned up. Bryce Creek has reopened, as probably a lot of you know. Also suffered a lot of damage this year. So again, all the information in this book and any other hiking guide is subject to change. Definitely didn't plan on some of the trails being closed because of big storms. So anyway, I would definitely recommend checking out Fairview Creek if you haven't been there. Okay, moving south into the Umpqua Basin. This is another one of my absolute favorite places in Oregon, Twin Lakes. It's up the North Umpqua and also in the center of a large roadless area called the Copeland Roadless Area. And it's another one of these hikes that has everything in my book that I love. It's got these beautiful lakes, as you can see here. It's got views. You can see Diamond Peak in the distance there, looking north. You can see Mount Bailey and Mount Thielsen down there in the South Cascades. It has meadows, and it's got some beautiful forests. It's because we're getting farther south into the Southern Cascades. There's trees that don't live as far north as here, like the Shasta Red Fir. Beautiful ancient Shasta Red Firs in this area. Some of them burned. There was a fire in this area just 2 summers ago. But it really didn't affect the trail very much, and you don't have to walk through many areas that are completely burned. So again, another place to sort of watch the fire recovery as you go back year after year, hopefully. And this area is in, oops, back, please. Okay, this area is in what Oregon Wild's calling our Crater Lake Wilderness campaign. Or Crater Lake Wilderness proposal. So someday we hope to connect the existing wilderness areas in the southern Cascades surrounding Crater Lake National Park, and the various wild forests that kind of spill down the slopes of those mountains would be protected as wilderness as well. And so Twin Lakes would be part of that. One of the unique things about this wilderness proposal is that it's the headwaters of 5 major river systems in Oregon: the Deschutes, Klamath, Willamette, Umpqua, and Rogue. Thank you. I should have it in my brain. Okay. Thank you. So moving a little further afield, I got to, as I went out into eastern Oregon, where I was less familiar with the places to hike, I was just so pleasantly surprised by some of the forests that I found out there. The region that I think I enjoyed the most was the northern Blue Mountains. Part of that was because it's so not traveled. I mean, there were just so few people out there. It takes a long time to get there. In fact, this hike shown here, this along South Fork Desolation Creek, is pretty aptly named. It took about an hour and a half to get to this hike from Highway 395, and that was turning off about an hour south of Prineville, so it's really out there. But it's spectacular. There's a great mix of trees. This shows a western larch and lodgepole pine forest, but there's also Engelmann spruce and moist areas, and I really didn't know what to expect, and so I found myself very pleasantly surprised with this whole area. There's 2 hikes in this region in the North Fork Umatilla Wilderness, which I wasn't even sure was a wilderness area, but sure enough, it's absolutely gorgeous. So it was great to get this far out there. Okay, and one more. In the Blue Mountains region, so kind of right in the center of Central Oregon in the Malheur National Forest, I found some great hikes that were mostly along streams. And that's because that's where a lot of the forests are. You think of Central Oregon as being a lot of high desert, which it is, but along many of our river systems out there, we find some really beautiful ancient forests: Ponderosa pines, western larch, spruce, lodgepole, and then lots of broadleaf trees that live along the streams. So in this case, this picture is of the Malheur River Canyon Trail. This is in a designated wild and scenic river, and so it has a protected buffer that protects the forest along this stretch. And then other streams in this region that I hiked along were the North Fork of the Malheur and Myrtle Creek, which were both really beautiful as well. Myrtle Creek is still not protected as a wild and scenic river, and I encountered a lot of cows along that trail. So that's one of the things that that we could work on, protecting our forests a little better, is by protecting our streams from grazing. Okay, sorry, hit it one more time. Thank you. Okay, so if we're going to be able to enjoy all of these hikes for many years to come, we do need to protect the remaining ancient forests that we have. So I've talked a lot about the protections that are out there, but there are still a lot of these intact ancient forests in Oregon that don't have those protections. So I try to draw attention to those in the book, and the work that Oregon Wild does to ensure that they are protected in the future is just going to be vital if they are to remain. The other thing that we need to do, The other thing that we need to do is to restore these ecosystems. So we can protect existing forests, and that's great. But we also have done a lot of damage through past logging and road building, fragmenting these forest ecosystems and all they provide for us. And we can actually do some active management that many people are in favor of, that can help turn, sorry, this is a lot of clicks, Maggie. I'm going to ask you to do it slowly for me. Click. That can turn a forest that has been clear cut and regrows as a dense plantation, and they can be thinned to accelerate the structure and add some more diversity into those forests, so that someday they may again grow back into these and to have these ancient forest structures and function more like a forest. So that is a hopeful note. There are trade-offs with doing this. It does have impacts on the land, and it has impacts to carbon storage over time. But I think it could be very worth doing. And in Eastern Oregon, there's different types of restoration that are necessary. We need to reintroduce fire back into the landscapes that evolved with it for so long. So that can mean taking out some of the small trees that have grown in, which has led, and with fire suppression, we've led to a lot of, it's led to a lot of buildup of duff around large trees, which if fire was reintroduced, could kill those trees. And so there's some work that needs to be done before fire can be reintroduced. But prescribed fire and allowing natural fires to burn can be a low-cost way of restoring Eastern Oregon forests, so that we have these landscapes into the future. Okay, one more. Okay, and that is all. Thank you. All right, we have time for just a couple of questions before we move on to drawing raffle winners, right? All right, anybody have a question? Excellent, okay, good. Sure, the question's about, when trees are replanted after logging, it seems to be a lot of just the same species, and that is true, especially on private lands where the focus is on timber production. It pretty much is mostly one species being planted, and that's because it's being grown as a crop. On public lands, there is more of an effort to introduce diverse tree species into the forest, because the goal for many public lands managers is to restore habitat and ecosystems, and the goal isn't to produce timber as much as on private land. So it kind of depends on what the purposes of the forest are, but people are thinking about that in some places. It kind of depends. Yeah.
I'd like to point out that a lot of plantations are a single species, even age, but that's how Douglas fir grows, is even age without diversity with other species. That's a lot of what was logged off was even age Douglas fir, and the plantations that got in have been even age Douglas fir. So there is a good opportunity to recreate whatever conditions you want by doing that.
Sure, yeah, Douglas fir grows just fine by itself, but having some diversity in the forest makes it more resilient to all sorts of things, and better habitat. Sorry, there's a fly. And better habitat for wildlife with more diverse structure. So if I were going to manage a Douglas fir forest for ecosystem function, I would make sure that there were other tree species in there.
Even though there weren't other tree species in the original stand?
I think it totally depends, and each place is going to be unique. So I think it's hard to generalize that Douglas fir grew as a monoculture before we logged it. I don't know that that's true everywhere. The question's about removing duff around large trees in Eastern Oregon. I guess I wasn't recommending that we actually like go out there with rakes. That's not feasible. But in some places where you're really trying to protect those large trees that have that buildup, it might be feasible to do. I think it's more about removing the smaller trees and then being careful at where you do set prescribed fires, so that they don't get too close to those duff collars around the trees, so that those big ponderosa pines don't kind of get burned up unnaturally. So it's kind of a mix of things. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. It's so amazing to hear about your experience writing this book. You talked a little bit about the protections for wild and scenic rivers and how that extends to forests surrounding the rivers. I'm curious how those laws come into play for those lower regions when we talk about like the pipeline, the LNG pipeline going under the Road River, and how we protect those ancient forests around the Road River from such development.
Okay, so the question's about protections under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and how we can protect rivers in the cases of things like the Jordan Cove LNG pipeline, for example, that goes under the Rogue River and many other rivers. That pipeline plan does not impact the Wild and Scenic River. It's just not in the Wild and Scenic River corridor, so it doesn't extend there. Parts of the Rogue River are wild and scenic, but not all of it. So wild and scenic protections are great, and they're actually, probably we'll all hear more soon, that Senator Wyden is going to be proposing more wild and scenic rivers for Oregon, which can help protect forests. But specifically to like the LNG pipeline, there's that protection is not going to come into play, and so it means that management plans under the for each national forest need to reject that pipeline if it violates the management plan or other laws like the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. There's many laws that I think it's violating if it were to move forward. So we have to use all of those tools. So maybe time for one more question. Okay. Well, if anyone would like to purchase my book, I have copies here, and I'm happy to sell them to you. Thanks for listening and for coming out tonight. And I'll turn it back over to Maggie.